White birds, long necks, long legs, short tails, long bills, often found in loose flocks. These are the egrets. Any bird that looked like a stork once was classified into the order Syconiiformes. This included the herons and the egrets. Now with DNA hybridisation, we can look at the relationships between birds with a little bit more accuracy. And the herons and egrets have been taken out of Syconiiformes and placed into Pelecaniformes, which is a little bit of a surprise considering they don't have webbed feet. But remember, webbing of the toes is just syndactyly or an epithelial bridge joining between the toes. Pelecaniformes with the 4 toes have webbing going between all of the toes. This is called palmate, in contrast to semi-palmate, like ducks, has syndactyly only between 3 of the toes. The hallux or great toe at the rear is not webbed, but the herons and egrets have 4 full-length toes, spread out so they can walk on mud, just like a pelican without the syndactyly. So placement in an order and genera is far more dependent on osteology than webbing of the toes. So Pelecaniformes have 4 toes, not necessarily webbed. Another feature of the Pelecaniformes is the connection of the nostril to the sinuses. In most birds, the nares or the nostril goes directly into the prefrontal sinuses. But in Pelecaniformes, the nares opens directly to the mouth. Then from the mouth, the air goes indirectly back into the sinuses. Some birds have complex nostril development, with a good sense of smell exemplified in the pelagic birds. So with this indirect way of smelling via the olfactory nerve at the end of the sinuses, I suspect the Pelecaniformes have a reduced olfactory sense. Now within the order Pelecaniformes, we have 2 suborders in which Australian birds are found. Firstly, obviously the pelicans, or the Pelecanidae. The order into which we're going to look at the herons and the egrets is the Ardiidae. Now when you look up Ardiidae, it will take you to herons. But remember, the egret is a heron. And if you want to look at herons, there is a separate video from Plumes of Oz on this, which I would recommend. And today we just want to look at these white herons or egrets that are found in Australia. Now, 2 egrets standing side by side, one large, one small, one with the yellow bill, one with a black bill. One is called the greater, he's the larger with the yellow bill, and the smaller is called the little egret with the blackish bill. A group of wading birds, including 2 egrets, the greater and the little. Again, notice the yellow and the black bill. When the little extends his neck, he looks quite large. And the neck length on the little is about the same size as the body, whereas the neck length on the greater egret is greater than the length of the body. Here is the larger of the 2 birds. This is called the great egret. Big yellow bill, sharp at the point. The bird is white. The lores, in front of the eye, has a bare area, which is found throughout all the egrets. And in the greater egret, this bare area extends to behind the eye. Another feature to look for is a kink in the neck. Egrets and herons have a serpentine S-bend. Unlike a swan, it is not smooth. The reason for this is elongation of one of the upper cervical vertebrae. This works like a spear thrower when it catches fish. The kink is more pronounced in the greater egret, helping in identification. And in the greater egret, when the neck is extended, it is longer than the body of the bird. The cervical spine of an egret has 23 vertebrae, more than 3 times the number of cervical vertebrae in our own necks. Here the lores and the bill are yellow, but sometimes you can find variations in the colour of the lores and the colour of the bill. On this little egret, the lores are yellow as expected, but there is also yellow going along the bottom part of the bill. Yet previously we noticed that the little egret had a black bill. So what does the two-tone bill mean? In essence, it's an immature or a non-breeding bird. Observational sexing an egret is difficult. With the little egret you can get an idea because of the ribbons, but otherwise all egrets are sexually isomorphic. Little and greater egret, when in breeding mode, have a green coloration to the lores. These egrets doing a mating aerial display have different colour in the lores. The higher bird has the darker bill and the greenish colour to the lores, suggesting in breeding mode. Another greater egret in breeding mode with green lores and a darker bill. Here a group of young, immature little egrets. A little egret wading along the shoreline. Notice the elegance to it and the relative smooth neck. A close-up of the little egret. The bare area in front of the eye does not extend behind the eye, and the same is true of the intermediate egret. Nuchal ribbons are a characteristic of little egrets, and when they are long the bill is usually black and the lores may lose their yellow, signs that the bird is in full breeding mode. The male nuchal ribbons are often longer than that of a female. Associated with the nuchal ribbon, plumes may develop off the chest and tail. Little egrets have a fairly wide distribution, but the Australian subspecies has yellow only on the sole of the foot. The egret bill is made for catching fish. It is sharp pointed, and with that cervical vertebral body being longer just in the upper third, it can get high velocity darting motion to spear the fish. Notice that this bird also has a little bit of residual green in the lores, in keeping with post-breeding phase. This is a greater egret, for the bare skin goes beyond the rear part of the eye. When grazing for food, you will often see an egret doing stirring of the mud or tremulous activity to get the aquatic life closer to the surface. Water and shorelines are the first habitat of egrets. After that, the marsh grass adjacent to the ponds, where they can look for amphibians. The diet is mostly carnivorous, eating whatever they can find, whether it be fish, amphibian or insect. The yellow on the foot is only on the sole. This is in contrast to the African and European little egrets, where the colour is on the top and bottom of the foot. Here the long nuchal crest of a typical little egret in breeding mode. The longer it is, the more likely the bird is to be a male. Notice also the other plumage coming off this bird, suggesting it's in breeding mode. The typical Egretta plumes, highly in fashion during the Victorian era, and the demand was so high it nearly led to the extinction of some of the Northern Hemisphere egrets, which have more plumage than what we see in our southern counterparts. In terms of fishing, the little egret is by far the best fisher egret, but being the smallest, the other herons and egrets often take advantage of this. The little egret is far more animated in its fishing techniques than the other egrets. It really does flap its wings and move around in a most uncoordinated manner. Now I say that the little egret is the best fisher out of all the egrets, and the reason for this is that it can catch fish on the fly. Just watch this. Another little egret in breeding plumage, but yet it still has a pale section to the lower part of the bill. Again, another little egret catching fish. Leaving the little egret, let's take a look at another egret. This one, when the neck is extended, it is not longer than the bird body. And like the great egret, it has a yellow bill with a black tip. The build of the bird is a little bit more robust than what we would expect with a little egret. And having a yellow bill with only a very slight black tip, we know it's not a little egret. The kink in the neck is not as marked as what we would find in a greater egret, and this is perhaps because the neck is shorter. So it's easy to mistake this bird for a greater egret. But the bare skin in front of the eye does not extend behind the eye. So with the yellow bill and the failure of extension of the bare area, this is the classical feature of the intermediate egret. Now, if the bird is up close, or you have an excellent pair of binoculars, you can look at the gape, and the gape of a greater egret extends further than that of the intermediate and the little. Most egrets have the same habitat and dietary requirements, being found in wet marshland areas. Perhaps the exception to this is the cattle egret, that follows the cattle in the grassland areas. Now, looking at these cattle egrets, you'll notice that they had a brown head. Well, they are still egrets, for they are generally white. They only develop this brown feather coloration in the breeding phase. So you can see the confusion in calling a white bird a heron or an egret. Sometimes the birds are white, but at other times they change their colour. And this is also in birds like the reef egret, that can have two morphologies, either being a dark grey or a white. And so with the cattle egret, in breeding mode it develops the rusty colour, but when non-breeding it is the typical white egret. Cattle egrets follow the cattle. As the cows chew the grass, so the various life forms are exposed. The cattle egrets eating mostly invertebrates in combination with a few frogs, so they are not eating fish, and though you can find them in wetlands, they are mostly with cattle in the grassland areas. They are more angular than the egrets that we've looked at so far, and they have a slightly down-curved bill. And out of the egrets, the cattle egret is by far the most flock-orientated. Confusion with the intermediate egret is common, particularly when not in breeding plumage. But as you can see, it's more of a chiselled bird with fine features, whereas the intermediate has more stocky features. The gular lap just below the head is also more prominent in a cattle egret. Here with two birds next to this cow, you can see one has colour and one is white. The flock behaviour of the cattle egrets is not only seen as they glean, but also in flight. Going to the north of Australia, we find that the cattle egrets have exactly the same action as they do in the grassy southern areas, following where the cattle eat the grass. Here you can see this group have no tan colour at all. They are pure white. There is one further adaptation in the northern part of Australia that the cattle egrets have made, and that is following not the cattle but the cane cutting machinery, moving in on the freshly cut cane to glean whatever is exposed, mostly insects, small reptiles and amphibious forms. For those interested in taxonomic entomology, here is a list of the derivation of the egret names. On behalf of Plumes of Oz, thank you for watching this video. If you would like to subscribe, you will be notified of our next release of Birds in the Wild.